Have you ever had a thought that felt completely yours, only to realize later that someone else planted it there? Think about that for a second. What if the opinions you defend, the products you buy, the people you trust, and even the fears that keep you awake at night were not entirely your own? What if your mind has been influenced in ways so subtle that you never even noticed? And what if someone stood on a stage and revealed exactly how this process works? A talk so controversial that people claimed it exposed techniques that powerful organizations would rather keep hidden. A talk that many people now refer to as the banned TED Talk on mind control. Whether that label is true or not is almost irrelevant, because the ideas behind it are very real. And by the end of this video, you may never look at your own thoughts the same way again. Most people imagine mind control as something from science fiction, a hypnotist swinging a watch, a secret government experiment, a mysterious machine capable of rewriting someone's personality. But real mind control doesn't look like that. Real mind control is much quieter, much simpler, and much more effective. Because the best form of control is the kind that doesn't feel like control at all. Imagine a fish swimming through water. The fish never questions the water. It never notices it. The water is simply its reality. Now imagine that your environment works the same way. The news you consume, the content you scroll through, the conversations you hear, the advertisements you ignore, the social pressures surrounding you, all of these things create an invisible ocean, and every day, that ocean shapes your thinking, without permission, without announcement, without resistance. The scary part, most people never realize it's happening. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades. One of the most famous experiments involved a simple question: what seemed like an obvious visual puzzle? The answer was clear. Anyone could see it. But then something strange happened. Everyone else in the room intentionally gave the wrong answer. One after another, confidently, calmly, repeatedly. And suddenly many participants began abandoning what they could clearly see with their own eyes. Not because they were stupid, not because they were weak, because they were human. The desire to belong is one of the strongest forces in the human brain. People will often choose social acceptance over objective reality. Think about what that means. If a small group of strangers can convince someone to doubt their own eyes in a laboratory, what can millions of people do through social media? What can celebrities do? What can political movements do? What can corporations do? What can entire cultures do? The answer is simple. A lot more than most people realize. This is where the first layer of mind control begins. Not through force, through repetition. Because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates trust. Have you ever noticed how a song you hated suddenly becomes catchy after hearing it enough times? The song didn't change. Your exposure did. The same principle applies to ideas. The more often an idea appears, the more believable it starts to feel, even when it's false. This psychological effect has been demonstrated over and over again. People naturally assume that familiar information is more accurate than unfamiliar information. That's why propaganda works. That's why advertising works. That's why narratives spread. Not because they're necessarily true, because they're repeated, again and again and again, until they become part of the background. And once something becomes background noise, people stop questioning it. Now here's where things become even more interesting. Because influence isn't only about what you're told, it's also about what you're not told. Imagine walking into a library. Thousands of books surround you, but someone secretly removes every book containing a certain perspective. Would you know? Probably not. You would still feel informed. You would still feel agitated. You would still believe you reached your conclusions independently, yet your conclusions would have been shaped before you ever started thinking. This is known as controlling the frame, and it may be one of the most powerful forms of influence ever discovered. Because whoever controls the questions often controls the answers. Most people spend their lives debating inside frameworks they never chose, arguing over options someone else selected, defending positions someone else defined, without ever questioning the framework itself. That realization alone can completely change how you view information, but we're only getting started. Let's talk about emotion. Because emotion is the secret weapon behind nearly every successful influence strategy. People love to believe they're rational, logical, objective. But neuroscience tells a different story. Emotion frequently comes first, reasoning comes later. In other words, people often feel their way into beliefs, and then think their way into justifying them. This explains why facts alone rarely change minds. You can present evidence, statistics, data, research, and still fail to convince someone. Why? Because the emotional foundation remains untouched. The belief isn't protecting logic. The logic is protecting the belief. Once you understand this, countless things suddenly make sense. Political campaigns, marketing campaigns, online debates, viral trends, fear-based headlines. They aren't competing for your intelligence. They're competing for your emotions. And emotions are far easier to influence than most people realize. Fear is especially powerful. Fear narrows attention. Fear increases compliance. Fear creates urgency. When people are afraid, they become more likely to seek authority, more likely to follow crowds, more likely to accept simple solutions to complex problems. That's not an insult. It's biology. Our ancestors survived because they responded quickly to threats. The problem is that modern threats are often psychological rather than physical. Yet the brain still reacts in similar ways, and that reaction can be exploited. Social media. Never before in human history have billions of people carried influence machines in their pockets. Algorithms study behavior constantly. Every click, every pause, every like, every share, every second of attention. These systems learn what captures your mind. Then they deliver more of it. Not because they're evil, because they're optimized. Their goal is engagement. But engagement often rewards emotional intensity. Outrage, fear, tribalism, conflict. The result? People gradually enter customized realities. Two individuals can live in the same city, experience the same events, and hold completely different understandings of the world. Not because one is intelligent and the other isn't. Because they're consuming different streams of influence, different information, different narratives, different realities. And the longer those realities remain separated, the harder it becomes to bridge the gap. This is where many people begin asking a disturbing question. If influence is everywhere, can anyone truly think independently? The answer is yes, but it requires effort, a lot of effort. Independent thinking isn't a natural state. It's a discipline. It's something that must be practiced. Because the human brain loves shortcuts. Shortcuts save energy. Shortcuts reduce uncertainty. Shortcuts help us function. But shortcuts also create vulnerabilities. The first step toward protecting your mind is awareness, not paranoia. Awareness. There's a huge difference. Paranoia assumes every message is manipulation. Awareness simply recognizes that influence exists. Once you understand that influence exists, you can begin asking better questions. Who benefits from this message? What emotions is this content trying to elicit? Trigger? What assumptions are being presented as facts? What information might be missing? What perspective haven't I considered? These questions act like mental armor. They don't eliminate influence, but they reduce unconscious influence. And that's incredibly important, because the goal isn't to become impossible to persuade. The goal is to become harder to manipulate. Another powerful habit is intellectual humility. Most people think confidence protects them from deception. Often the opposite is true. The easiest person to manipulate is the person who believes they cannot be manipulated. Because they stop checking. They stop questioning. They stop examining their own blind spots. True intelligence isn't knowing you're right. It's recognizing that you could be wrong. That mindset creates flexibility. And flexibility creates resilience. The strongest minds aren't rigid. They're adaptable. They update when new evidence appears. They remain curious. They remain skeptical. Most importantly, they remain open. Now let's return to the idea of the banned TED Talk. Why does that phrase attract so much attention? Because people sense something important. Deep down, everyone understands that influence exists. Everyone has experienced moments where they later realized they were following a crowd, believing a narrative, repeating an opinion, defending an idea they never fully examined. We've all done it. The difference is that most people don't stop to analyze why. And that's exactly why discussions about mind control generate so much fascination. Not because people fear secret technologies, because they recognize something familiar, the realization that the battle for your mind isn't happening in a laboratory. It's happening every day. In conversations, in headlines, in entertainment, in advertisements, in culture, and perhaps most importantly, inside your own habits. The greatest form of mind control isn't forcing someone to think differently. It's convincing them they arrived at the conclusion entirely on their own. That's what makes influence so powerful and so difficult to detect. But here's the good news. The moment you become aware of the game changes. Not completely, not instantly, but significantly. Because awareness creates distance. Distance creates perspective, and perspective creates freedom. The ability to pause before reacting, the ability to question before believing, the ability to think before repeating. That may not sound dramatic, but it might be one of the most powerful skills a person can develop in the modern world, because information is no longer scarce. Attention is, and wherever attention goes, influence follows. So the next time you feel absolutely certain about something, pause. Ask yourself where that certainty came from. Ask yourself who benefits from it. Ask yourself whether you've explored the opposite viewpoint. Not because you're wrong, but because the search for truth begins where certainty ends. And maybe that's the real lesson behind every discussion about mind control. The most dangerous prison isn't made of walls. It's made of assumptions. The strongest chains aren't wrapped around your body. They're wrapped around your thinking. And the key has been in your hands the entire time. Awareness, curiosity, and the courage to question what everyone else accepts without thinking. If you can do that, you've already taken the first step towards something rare. A mind that truly belongs to you.